Hello and welcome. I'm going to give you a video lecture on Sigmund Freud, Chapter 1 in our personality textbooks. And I'll be looking at the study guide as we talk about Sigmund Freud. And I'll also be using the book. So let's get started. This is Chapter 1 of Personality and Personal Growth. And talking about Sigmund Freud. So the first part, I'm not going to ask you anything about the personal history. Obviously, it's very interesting, and the book starts off with Sigmund Freud because he is a very influential individual. He's no longer living, but his legacy still exists to this day, and many people don't even realize that a lot of what we talk about still comes from Freud. And so what Freud, he was a medical doctor, and he did a lot of his theories originate from case studies. So he would look at one individual in depth, and then he was well read, and then he would come to his theories. And he didn't discover the unconscious. As a matter of fact, they had been talking about it more than 2,000 years prior. But what Freud had done for the unconscious was really bring it to light. He was a prolific writer, which means he wrote a lot of books, very influential, and a lot of his theories are very controversial. To this day, we don't, since Freud didn't do a lot of scientific research, there's a lot of things that he was very wrong about, and he's even been accused of being very sexist. And so but the reason we still study him and we still talk about him is because of his influences that he had. And so, for example, if you think that dreams have any form of meaning in your life, that's from Freud. If you ever talk about the ego or the unconscious, that's Freud. If you ever heard of a Freudian slip where someone might say something sexual in nature as a mistake, instead of saying move the column on an Excel file, they say move the condom, and so that this is what would be considered called a Freudian slip. Let's see what else. If you've ever thought of that some people might have memories, or you might have memories that have been been pushed to the back of your mind, or you repressed them, that is also Freud. So again, he permeates our culture, and so much so that people oftentimes don't even realize that some of the things that they're saying or joking about or um, are talking about comes from Sigmund Freud. So with that, let's get to the major concepts. So one of the first things that Freud talks about is this idea of psychic determinism. So right here, he says that he didn't believe that there was no continuities in mental life, and all thought and all behavior have meaning. So every thought that comes to mind, it didn't just come at random, but it came from something else. So nothing occurs randomly. There is a cause, even multiple causes, for every single thought, feeling, memory, or action. Every mental event is brought about conscious or unconscious intention. And so, to give you an example of this, I remember one time I was in a form of meditation and I was reflecting on this event that had happened. And in it, I was realizing that I was kind of guilty for being a bully with a friend of mine. And long story short, you know, at one point I went off on a tangent, maybe for a good 10 minutes, and I was thinking about this person who I hadn't thought about in a long time, and I was basically saying that this guy was a jerk. And I was reflecting on how much of a jerk he was when I knew him in college. And then I stopped at that moment and I realized, how did I get to thinking about this person, since I haven't even spoken to him in more than 10 years? And so as I started backtracing how I came to think about this person, I realized that the moment I jumped onto this tangent or thinking about him was the moment that I realized that I was guilty of being a bully. And so, in a way, my own defensive mechanism said, hey, instead of thinking about me being a bully, something I don't like to think about myself, I thought of my brain kicked in and quickly thought of someone else. So this idea of psychic determinism says that when you have a thought that just pops up to mind, it didn't come randomly. It's coming from deep within you or in the unconscious. And so that's what we mean by psychic determinism. Okay, consciousness is self-evident. And Freud, the way he described this, he said, the what is conscious or what you're aware of is the tip of the iceberg. And so an iceberg that is frozen, like the Titanic hits this iceberg, well, you only see the tip of it, but what's underneath is this massive amount of ice. And that's what Freud would call the unconscious. As a matter of fact, he used the iceberg as an analogy. I don't know if he used it specifically, but it's tied to Freud, where the iceberg or the unconscious is vast in comparison to what you see or what you become aware of. So in that example I just gave you, I was able to become aware of where that thought came from or why I thought this guy was a jerk. And when I was able to trace it back. And for me, that really made sense. Okay, what is the preconscious? Well, he calls it the part of the unconscious, but a part that can be easily made conscious. Accessible portions of memory are part of that. That might include memories of everything a person did yesterday, a middle name. So he said everything that is kind of like in the background, but it's right there and it can be pulled to the front. A lot of times I think of this as well as of, when someone asks you or you hear a song and you don't know where it comes from and you're like, oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. That's what I imagine with the preconscious. And then finally, the unconscious. Okay, so within the unconscious are the elements that have never been conscious and are never accessible. So this is where Freud really becomes controversial. Freud had kind of believed that in this unconscious it's this the id, right? It's where the id lives, but it's this kind of like an animal sexual nature that might be aggressive, and that's the unconscious that Freud had kind of painted. um, so he says when a conscious thought or a feeling seems unrelated to the thoughts and feelings that precede it, he said the connections are present but unconscious. Once the unconscious links are found, then the discontinuity is resolved. So in other words, finding out, um, when you trace it back, you can find it. He said that some of our material that's in this unconscious or the hidden part of our mind is censored or it's repressed, like it's too difficult to deal with, and so therefore we repress it. All right, and that was his idea. Okay, so from there, what does he have? He says impulses. They in the back in the day they used to call them instincts, but impulses are drives or pressures to act without conscious thought toward particular ends. And he says the ultimate cause of all activity comes from these drives that we have. And he goes on to name them, and he says they all have four components. In the study guide, if you notice, let's go back to that. I didn't ask you about those. Okay, I said define the impulses and tell me what the two basic impulses are. Okay, so at this point, I would kind of, looking at this study guide, I might read this section, which I have before, but I would more move on to the next part. So he said the basic impulses. He said that there was these two forces. Okay, so this was his early model. He said the sexual or life-maintaining eros, the erotic, physically gratifying, and then the aggressive or destructive. He later described the forces more globally as life-supporting or death-encouraging. So that's really interesting. So the basic drive of all human beings comes from this life-supporting or death-encouraging, life and destruction. And that's very interesting, right? So, and he says, so Freud, the whole sexual nature of it, he talks about sexual development, and I didn't ask you guys to get into it because there's not too much research that supports his idea of this penis envy and his idea of the Oedipus complex. You can read it; it's very interesting. A lot of people, in our current society know about this, but the reason I left it out of the study guide was because of the reason that there is not as much evidence as there is for other theories of development. Okay, so the libido. So that's what he called, those are the basic impulse, those two drives. So the life encouraging, or I'm sorry, um, excuse me. Yes, right. Okay, so So the two forms of basic impulses.